All right, well, hello everyone, and welcome back to our third monthly webinar for Students of Welcome. I'm Tanner Smith, the Field and Constituencies intern for the Forum and a student at Kent State University in Ohio. And if you're new to this, Students of Welcome is a national student-led movement focusing on changing the conversation around immigration, and we're looking for students all over to join us on their own college campuses. So I posted more information in the chat on that if you want to get connected and try to start something on your campus. And with the holiday season coming up, we have two very special guests today. I have the pleasure of introducing Tess Clark, Director of We Choose Welcome, to talk about good ways to handle hard conversations when you're going home for Thanksgiving dinner. That might come up. And then followed by Ashley Glimowshinsky, also with We Choose Welcome, who started a new podcast called Hope in Action, Navigating Immigration with Hope and Care. Ashley and Tess, thanks so much for being here today. And I'm going to start off with Tess. Tess, can you give a brief introduction about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. As Tyler said, I have the honor of being the director of We Choose Welcome. I've been there now for about 8 years. And really, what we do and what we focus on is creating community through our digital platform and then providing people opportunities to take advocacy actions, to go through different learning resources with us, to find volunteer opportunities within their sphere. And so we're just really, we'd say we're a community of women focused on welcome, on really having hard conversations and changing the culture within our Christian communities.
Thank you so much, Tess. And for kind of changing the conversation and culture around these Christian communities, do you have a hard time kind of navigating conversations that can become emotionally charged with people that might disagree with you? And then how do you go through conversations like that?
Yeah, I think, I would say for a lot of us, we've watched things become more and more polarized over time. I would say when I was in college, which was a really long time ago, I won't date myself too much, but I do have 4 kids and one of them is in high school. So I'm a lot older than all of you guys. It seems like you could have civil disagreements with people and walk away and still be friends. But I think there's almost like this form of identity politics, right? So if I agree with Republicans on one issue, then I'm a Republican. If I agree with Democrats on one issue, I'm a Democrat, where I think so many of us sit somewhere in the middle. Like we're a lot more nuanced in our thoughts, right? Our convictions are leading us to the way we think and feel. But I think because of that polarization, like people are finding their identity in politics. So it feels like, hey, if we disagree on this issue, I disagree with like your whole self. And so I think that that is where those conversations become more difficult, as you guys might have experienced in your lives. Like I've definitely entered conversations where I'm like, whoa, that took like a really sharp turn really fast. And if you step back and kind of analyze where it went, you're like, man, okay, this, whether it was me or them, felt offended personally. Um, and I think that that's a lot of what we have going on now, which makes these conversations difficult, as you mentioned, Tanner.
Thanks. Yeah, I've kind of noticed with talking to my friends at college some too that a lot of times you might go into area that suddenly becomes super politically charged and turns into like a us them scenario. What kind of mindset would you have, and what kind of mindset would you advise other people to have going into the conversations where they're talking with loved ones that disagree with them and they might be wary that they go into a subject area that can get super dicey and talking to other people about?
Yeah, man, if I'm operating in the spirit and not in my flesh, let's say that, I would say to get curious, right? Like it's really hard for someone to be offended if your question is like, can you tell me more about that? Or I'm really interested to know why you think that way. Or, have you had a personal experience that's led you to feel like this about a group of people? Like approaching a conversation with grace and with curiosity, I think it's really hard for someone to be offended. And then the hope is that they would then be disarmed and extend that to you. And so I think we have to go into it thinking about, I think for me, I go, man, there are so many subjects that I am not fully educated on, but I might already have a developed opinion, right? I might bring my implicit bias to this place in this conversation. So I would want maybe someone who has more experience and who's more educated in that conversation to approach me with curiosity, to give me grace, the same grace I hope to extend to someone when it comes to a conversation about immigration or refugees, because that's something that I maybe know more about than they do, right? But maybe they've had a specific experience and that they're holding on to, or I mean, gosh, we're all living it, right? Our algorithms are insane. I mean, for some of the work we do, sometimes I will follow someone who might not think like I do, but I'm like, man, I want to know what are people seeing and hearing. And then 2 days later, my entire feed is like anti-immigrant rhetoric. And it's easy to like see that and start to believe that when that's the only information you're being given, or to go, oh, like, so I think that'd be my advice as much as you can. Like, ask the Holy Spirit to lead and guide the conversation, take some really deep breaths, decide that in this moment, like, your goal is to be curious and to, I don't want to say bring unity because we may not always like end up agreeing, but I think if someone can walk away from the conversation, even being disagreed with, or going, man, we didn't see eye to eye on that, but I felt seen by Ashley, by Tanner, by Christy. Like I feel like they know me more. There's this really cool form of Japanese art called kintsugi where they actually like, Ashley will know more about this than me, so if I butcher it, jump in. But the whole form of art is to like break the pottery and then to glue it back together with gold. And then the gold veining is actually the really beautiful part of it. And so I think sometimes if we think about conflict and doing conflict well, like if we can come back together, that relationship can be more beautiful and even stronger. And I think that's one of the cool things about the Japanese art is it's actually stronger in the end. It would be harder to break the second time. So I try to keep that visual in for me because it helps me like see the end goal, which isn't to be right. It's not to prove my point, but it's to hopefully get to say my point and to be heard. And no one's going to hear me if they think I'm not hearing them, you know?
Great, thank you. I really liked that visual. And so you train women in peacemaking practices, and I know you kind of mentioned one technique a little bit of just being curious and wanting to know more about a person that thinks different than you. Is there any other techniques that translate well into a family setting or a family gathering where people might be giving their opinions freely, and those opinions might be very different from yours or touch on something that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I I know these practices. I don't always practice them. So don't I'm I'm always learning and growing and trying to remember these things. But I think there's some guys named John Huckins and Jared Swigart who led a group called the Global Immersion Project. And I went through some of their peacemaking training and I love their kind of four steps. They say, see, immerse, contend, restore. And so, see is kind of this idea that we would see people made in the image of God, see people with the eyes that God sees them with. Like, God, this is your like child. You love them. You created them. So help me see them the way that you see them. Help me immerse into kind of this broken reality with curiosity. And then how do I contend for the flourishing of them and for myself and of our friendship or our relationship? And then if in that place things are kind of broken, how do we move towards restoration? And that I like those four principles. You're not always going to like see them to fruition, right, in one conversation. But I think if we come to that Thanksgiving table, for example, let's use that one and say, I want to see people the way you see them, God. Like, help me, give me eyes to see my uncle where we disagree on every issue the way that you see him. And we might just come with more grace and more patience, and they might then see Jesus in us, right? And man, like I felt loved, even though I think what they were saying was that they don't agree with me. Um, but wow, like they experienced something different. in that space because you came with those eyes to see.
That's so awesome. I'm glad that you can have ways of reaching out to people that you disagree with everything on, basically. And going into like might have families that are Christian or religious. How can faith-based language, which you mentioned a little bit there, how can faith-based language and Christian-like language create bridges in these conversations around immigration?
I think like establishing and maybe in a creative way some like baselines like hey, the conversation starts, let's agree like we believe all people are made in the image of God. We won't argue that, right? Like there's an Imago Dei, the Bible's really clear. God planned every single person on earth for his purposes. And so I think like knowing your family, your Christian heritage, the way that you guys talk and bringing in some of that like truth, right? Okay, well we know that Jesus tells us to love the foreigner among us. Like we'll just start there. Now we might disagree about what that means, right? But we can at least start on the foundation of like, for some people, I'll give an example. Like, there's people in my family who would say, hey, I agree with you. The Bible says that. And if there's a foreigner here currently, I want to move towards them and love them. I agree. We should serve them. If they need things, we should meet their needs. But I don't think that that's a mandate on America. I think it's a mandate on a Christian. So I don't think we should open up and accept any more asylum seekers or refugees because our country is struggling right now. Let's just say that that was someone's stance. Okay, well, that's a baseline for a conversation. And we might disagree, but we agree on the Christian's call, right? Like we can maybe put like what's America's call with the foreigner, but like, okay, well, that's great. Like, let's talk about how we can love and contend for the people God has put in our life in front of us, for our neighbors at risk of being deported by ICE. And like, we could talk about that because we believe we're supposed to love them as we love ourselves. So, how would we love ourselves through that? And so, find those commonalities and start there. I think are really great. And the Imago Dei is like one that no one can really argue with, right? And so, hey, we're not going to use offensive language when we talk about people that we disagree with. We're going to use humanizing language. Like, hey, instead of saying alien, we can say undocumented immigrant. And so just giving, I think, again, all with as much grace as you can muster, um, creating some common language, like you mentioned, Tanner. I think that's a great question.
Thank you. And I know a lot of Christians, we have these baseline beliefs that we can all agree on. But then there's also family members and members of our churches that might have their own opinions and other things around immigration. So what do you think are like misunderstandings that you see a lot around immigration within the church or around family members that are Christian? And how do you think we can address those with truth and also compassion?
Yeah, I think in Ashley's podcast speaks to this too, and we have some things on our website. I mean, why don't they come the legal way? Or man, how so and so here legally and they're not, or the difference even between an asylum seeker, a refugee, an undocumented immigrant, a dreamer. Like, and I know that it's so nuanced and it gets so kind of messy, but if you have time to educate yourself on some of that, some of it's kind of, it makes the conversation a little easier to navigate. Well, actually, like, we don't need all these refugees here. Let's say that's someone's thought. Well, actually, they're dangerous. Well, refugees are actually more vetted than your neighbor, than your student, your kid's teacher. Like they go through such a rigorous vetting process. They're usually waiting for years. So by the time they come here, like we do know who they are and we do know their history. And so knowing, I think some of those like facts that someone could look up later, it's really helpful because it is such a muddy kind of conversation and some of it is confusing. And there are, and I think also acknowledging to the fact where you feel comfortable. So like for me, I agree we should know who's in our country. So if people have crossed the border with a criminal history, like we want to know who they are, and we maybe don't want them to be in our country. I would also like for those people to go back home and be, charged or whatever, go through a trial in their own country. Okay. So we don't have to say sometimes someone's like, oh, you want open borders. Let's say that's for an example, right? That might be something at your table says, well, you're just for open borders, or you're a bleeding heart liberal, or you're just buying into XYZ. And it's like, actually, no, like I agree with you. We don't want open borders. We want to know who's in our country. I don't want criminals here either. Actually, I would like it if those people were deported, but like who I don't want deported is like the single mom who's been here 20 years, who's going for her check-in as she's done because she's been pursuing things legally for her to be deported because she's doing everything that she's supposed to do and that she's allowed to do. For me, dreamers, that's especially for college kids, like, and young adults, hey, like, I resonate with some of these people. Like, they're my age and they were brought here as a little bitty kid and they didn't have a choice. They didn't choose to come illegally. Their parents did that, but feel more American than they feel anything else. And so I'm saying, let's give them a pathway to become citizens. They want to live here, they want to contribute. And so just knowing you don't have to know everything. And I think that's where people become paralyzed in the immigration conversation. And it happens to me too. We'll feel like, God, I don't know everything. And be honest about that. Be like, look, I don't know everything. There are probably some places where I'm going to get this wrong, but like, here's a few things I do know. It's actually the only way someone can seek asylum is to be on American soil. At this point, that's our law. I know there's people trying to change that and give people an opportunity to seek asylum in a neighboring country. That'd be great. And they don't have to cross the Darien Gap. But imagine being so desperate that you would come just to set foot to claim asylum, knowing you may or may not get it. You're spending every dollar that you have. And so storytelling is such a great way to do this. If you have a personal relationship with someone with an immigration story, sharing that with the people at your table, because it's really hard to argue with someone's story, right? We've taken border trips and some of the women who've come, they get to say at their table, like, I've actually been to the border. I met people in migrant shelters. Like, can I tell you about Maria, whose story I heard? For me, one of the more impactful stories was that I went to a immigration detention center. I met a mother who was taken in front of her children whose parents brought her here as a child illegally. And she always had fake papers and she didn't know they were fake. Like her mom and dad had them made. She then gets married, has babies, is working in the United States, doesn't even know she's here illegally, ends up being part of a raid at her workplace, is taken from her girls. Okay, we can talk about that. Do you think she should have an opportunity to petition her case? Most people are going to go, absolutely. She didn't have any malice. And so just helping like speak from your personal experience if you have some or have a personal story of someone that you know and be like being honest about the fact that you don't know everything, that you're here learning alongside this person that you're having the conversation with, and that you agree the border shouldn't be open because that helps, right? Like we can at least establish a foundation of like we all want to know who's here in our country. Absolutely.
That's awesome. I like how you talk about finding common ground, kind of shaping stories of compassion and understanding other people when you're talking to family. So just last question here before you have to get going. If you could encourage families to partake in one act of welcome this holiday season, what would it be?
That's a great question. I mean, maybe I'll give you two answers. I think one for a family who's maybe there and ready, like inviting someone into your home to share a meal, right? Like food is such a great place to kind of break down barriers. Um, and there are a lot of immigrants who tell you they've never been to an American's home ever. And I heard a story once at a church event, and I'll be honest, I don't know if this was a true story or if it was someone anecdotally telling a story, but they were saying how they had met this Egyptian man who'd come over to study for his PhD. And he was like heading out back home to Egypt. He'd graduated. They were like, "Man, what did you like love about America? Did you have any like regrets about coming?" Kind of that type of conversation. He said, "I came with a whole suitcase of gifts to give to people who hosted me. And I think I'm the saddest that I'm going back home with a whole suitcase of gifts because no one ever invited me to their home through my entire PhD program." And I guess I think about that a lot because I think it's so easy for us to like just go through our day in and day out, hang out with the same people, and not necessarily um, look up and look around and go like, who might be lonely, who might be here looking to connect. And so if you thought, man, my family, that's the kind of family I'm in. Like we love to cook and host people. Let's invite someone over. And then another one, some things you could do like, hey, we're shopping for ingredients to cook. Let's go to an immigrant grocery store, one neighborhood over, and hey, mom, that would be fun. And when we walk around, like, let's ask God to give us eyes to see people the way he does and just smile and say hello. And I think that's a way to extend welcome because it's not often that people who might shop in those grocery stores see people who have a more of an American identity there and then being kind. And I think the welcome will be reciprocated both ways, right? Like putting yourself maybe in a situation that you're not totally comfortable in, putting yourself in a place where you're the minority also kind of, has that effect where like, man, now when I'm back in my little safe community where I know everybody, like I'll maybe remember that experience. And so those are things families can do. We Choose Welcome has a really awesome Advent guide. You can download that and go through that as a family or as a friend group because it's called God on the Move. And so you see some of the migration story throughout the Bible. And there's some different things in there that are challenges and questions you can ask yourself. But yeah, I think entering in um, to places and spaces that you're ready, that you feel like, man, my family would be ready for this, right? So I'd say Advent Guide would be like your low level, go to a grocery store where it's more of an immigrant community, and then I invite someone over that maybe doesn't look like you or think like you or come from where you come from. I always tell people like if everyone in your phone and everyone on your Facebook feed and in your Instagram feed like looks like you and thinks like you and comes from the same socioeconomic background as you, like that's not the kingdom of God, right? Like the kingdom doesn't look like that. It's not homogenous. And so, like, to me, I want to be a part of what God's doing on earth. I want to be a part of bringing heaven to earth. I want to step into what Jesus is already doing. Jesus doesn't need me to bring him to an immigrant neighborhood. He's there. He might even be more present there half the time. But I get to join him in what he's already doing on earth. Like, that's amazing. And so if you have a family who are Christians, even that, like, mom, I know like God's on the move here. Like, come with me. Let's go do this together. Um, like the invitation stands for us to partner with what Jesus is already doing. And then we get the blessing from that too, right? And that's pretty cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tess. That was really valuable information. I'm going to be using that going home for Thanksgiving. Maybe try to invite some friends along with me. But thank you so much for joining
Love it.
us, and thank you for
Yes,
that
thank you. I'm sorry I
conversation.
have to jump because I'm a mom of four and one of my kids gets out of school in 3 minutes. So thankfully it's close. I'm gonna run down the road, but y'all are in for a treat to hear from Ashley as well. And hopefully this is recorded so I can watch it later. Thanks, you
Yes,
guys.
thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having me. Bye.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
All right, so now moving on to Ashley. Ashley, thanks so much for being here. Can you
Of
tell us
course.
a little bit more about yourself and the podcast that you started?
Yeah, so my name is Ashley Klimashinsky, which is a fun last name, and you may wonder why I say it like that when it's spelled like something else. But that's because my husband is a Polish immigrant. And so I took his last name. And so that's why we keep the Polish pronunciation of it, which is Gali. He could say it even more than I can, Gali. But so I started the podcast after working with We Choose Welcome and another organization here in my city of Raleigh, North Carolina, working with refugees. And after sponsoring my husband, I kind of got thrown into the immigration space because I fell in love with a foreigner and I had to learn how to navigate that pretty quickly. And so just through navigating that whole process and meeting people along the way and meeting refugees and immigrants and then, an immigration attorney who is my co-host, we kind of felt there was a need for people to understand what the immigration system is, how it works, and also noticing that from a Christian perspective, there was kind of a disconnect between our faith and immigration as well. And we saw a lot of podcasts or, platforms talking about either the faith aspect or the law aspect, but nothing was really combining the two. So that's why we decided to come up with a podcast that bridged those two spaces that were both really important to me and my co-host.
That's awesome, Ashlyn. I listened to a couple clips from your podcast so far. I gotta go through a whole episode soon, but I've noticed that it has a very like gentle and gracious tone. Is that intentional? And how do both you and your co-host talk with such grace when it might be in the face of people who think terrible things about immigrants or disagree so strongly with you?
Yeah, it's really hard sometimes, but I think, like I said, I was kind of thrown into the immigration space. So when my husband and I got engaged, we thought he'll just come to the United States because it will be so easy for him to come to the United States. And at the time, we were both living in Poland. And so it was a big decision for us to just pick up and move. But I quickly learned that immigrating to the United States is not easy. And I realized that as an American who has never been through that process, and most Americans don't ever go through that process, we don't know anything about the system. So, of course, you might have a lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings. And that's not a fault of anyone here in the United States. It's not like our, history courses or civics teach about immigration. We barely learn about our own government, right? Or if we do, it's like 1 year in high school and then we don't remember it anymore. So it's not the fault of anyone that they don't know why our immigration system works, but it is something that I feel like people can learn about. Like Tess said, we often form opinions about things that we're not informed on. And we can still hold strong opinions on those, even though we may have, incorrect understandings of things. So when we came to this podcast, we wanted to approach it in that way, thinking that, not everyone is going to understand this and they might have misconceptions as well, but how can we approach it in a way that is informative, but also not being like, why don't you know this? Like, come on, you should know this by now. Because really, the understanding is that we don't know it, and that's okay. And that partly comes from my background in teaching. I was a teacher for about 12 years, both in the United States and overseas, mostly teaching ESL. And, as a teacher, you come to the subject and hopefully you know what you're talking about, right? Like you've had some studies, you have experience in it, you are somewhat of an expert in the topic. But if you come to your class and say, like, this is what you're going to learn, and you have to learn this and this and this, and why don't you know this already? That's not going to get your students anywhere. And so instead, you have to approach it by asking a couple of questions or just knowing the background of your students. Like, what do you know already? What would you like to learn? Or what do we need to build on? Where are you coming from in this place? And then you have to be able to break down the knowledge that you have in a way that's informative, but also shareable. So you can't just approach like a big math problem with, here's the whole problem all at once. I did not teach math, by the way, so that's that's just an analogy. But being able to break down like large chunks of information into smaller pieces, is just really important for teachers and for students to learn together. And that's also what I think was helpful in this podcast to say that there's a lot of really difficult topics that we're going to talk about here, and it's okay if you don't know, but we're going to go through this together. Unfortunately, with a podcast, it does mean that a lot of it is just us speaking to people. So we don't know what the feedback is, if they're learning it, what they know already. But that's why we try to approach it from a very base level of like, this is what a refugee is. This is what an asylum seeker is. This is what a green card is. Here's what a citizen is. Just like really basic definitions so that we can build from there and hopefully build understanding as well. So when we are faced with the comments of, oh, you're advocating for illegals too, why don't you advocate for only legals or, send them all back where they came from? We do get comments like that. And it's hard to see those things, and to think that, like, wow, there's so much animosity towards people who are made in the image of God. But that's why we include the faith piece as well, saying that these people are made in the image of God, and how can we approach them as such? Can we see them as human before we see them as refugee or asylum seeker or citizen? Knowing that we're all foreigners in this world, really, according to the gospel, that none of us are in our forever home, that we're citizens of a kingdom that we have not been to yet. So, as we're all traversing through this life in this world, how can we extend grace to others in the way that we've been given grace to go to a place that we are not in yet? So, that was a long answer to your question, but I just think approaching people with humanity and understanding and trying to understand where they're coming from too is a big part of our podcast.
Yeah, that's an awesome way to explain all of that. And kind of through your podcast talking about these difficult conversations, and I'm sure with teaching and having other comments to your face about things that people disagree with you so strongly about, or could even be having of a strong and harsh tone. Has there been some techniques that you've found to diffuse tension or build bridges in those difficult conversations around immigration?
Yeah, and so what I was saying earlier about how it's a podcast and how we speak to people, but it's just like, we've recorded ahead of time. We don't have a chance for a conversation in that time. And so when we do have conversations with people, it does tend to be online through comments or chats and things like that. And in that case, like when it's a virtual conversation and not like an in-person conversation, my first response is to not say anything. Like it's to back out of that conversation, or the chat or whatever, and to pray and to give myself some breathing room. Because, for example, there's a post that I put on Facebook this morning about how US citizens can help immigrants in this time that we're facing, especially as I live in Raleigh. We've had CBP here in the last week and ICE operations as well. And so I had a post about, here's what citizens can do to help our immigrant neighbors. And someone responded, are you advocating for the illegals or the legals? And I was like, feel that tension rise, feel that anger rise. Like, why are we talking about illegal versus illegal? They're human. But I have not responded to that comment. I saw it about, 20 minutes before I came to this webinar. And I just needed time. I don't want to respond in the moment because I will respond in anger. I will respond in that flash of like, well, how can you think that? And so instead, what I'm doing is I'm taking that breathing room, taking that space to ask God for peace, for calm, to be able to explain compassionately, but also to see this person as a fellow human as well. We talk often in this work about how, love your neighbor, and we often refer to the neighbor as our immigrant neighbor, but our Americans, fellow citizens, are also our neighbors, and they are also human and also made in the image of God. So I ask God to remind me of that when I respond to comments like this. Like, this person is also an image bearer, and this person may have misunderstandings, like the difference between an illegal immigrant versus a legal immigrant. Um, Spoiler alert, I don't think there is such thing as an illegal immigrant, but that's another topic. So when it comes to contentious conversations, if I can, I try to step back first. If it's a virtual online conversation, then I can take a moment to just breathe and think and respond in a way that is loving. If it's an in-person conversation, that's when I ask questions. Tess said it so well, like when you're in a place like that, try to understand where they're coming from first, rather than saying like, well, how could you think like that? When I ask, illegal or illegal immigrant, why don't you say instead like, well, why do you think like that? Try to understand where they're coming from first, because that is going to diffuse the conversation rather than responding back with, oh, well, this is the truth and this is the truth, and this fact and this fact. Like Tess said, it's easier to lead with stories than with facts. Because facts are important, yes, but if you're both in a heightened state of emotion, facts aren't going to matter because that's not important to you right now. But if you're saying, like, this person that I know experienced this, or me sponsoring my husband through the immigration system, this is what I experienced. And when you bring it back down to the level of human experiences rather than abstract figures or numbers and things like that, it's a personal connection that makes it a little bit more human. Again, we just insert that humanity back into the conversation rather than continuing to go on like, well, this fact versus this fact versus this fact. And a lot of that comes back to like, why do you think that? Because we have misunderstandings that sometimes, we've heard from friends or family or what we call a trusted news source. But really, a lot of our opinions are made up of like our fears and our hopes. And so someone may be responding to something that they've heard based on their fear. So when they're asking about illegal versus illegal, maybe it's not really a matter of if they care about the law or if they even know the law. Maybe it's their fear that there are too many people of a different culture coming into the country, and that worries them. Well, how is it going to change their way of life and their job and their community? So rather than coming back with facts, it's easier to say, well, why do you think that? And maybe we can come to an understanding of why you believe that. And that will help me then respond in a way that's loving and seeing you in your full personhood as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know with conversations that can get heated, it's super hard sometimes in person, but even especially online to respond in those compassionate ways and just be curious. And you mentioned a little bit before when you might take a break from a harsh comment, you go to God. And I just want to know, how does your Christian faith in that way inform you of how to respond to those difficult conversations?
Yeah, like I said, it helps me remember that we are all made in the image of God. Some of what we do at We Choose Welcome is we humanize immigrants, right? By sharing stories and reminding people of that. And then I went to the border a couple years ago and I met Border Patrol officers or Border Protection officers. And it kind of hit me in that moment that they were human too. And it may sound like a strange realization, but so much we can vilify the other who's not like us. And so God reminded me in that moment, like I made them too. You may not agree with everything that they're doing or what they believe in, but they are still my children and I care for them also. So when I come into conversations with people who disagree with my views, I kind of stop and remember again, made in the image of God, human. And in the same way that Jesus had grace for me and compassion for me before I knew what sin was, before I knew the separation between myself and God, like Jesus was a sacrifice on the cross for me. And so that means that like if I could receive such grace and such compassion, who am I to not give that even in the smallest amount to another person? Um, Obviously I can't offer salvation, but I can at least say like, can we love each other? Can we come back to some of the gospel message of loving your neighbor and of caring for your community and doing what Jesus did? And he talked with people he didn't disagree with all the time. The people he didn't agree with, hung him on the cross. And yet he still said, forgive them for they know not what they do. Like that kind of grace. If I can have just a little bit of that in my conversations, that's what I would like to see myself do as a Christian.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that. Yeah, I like your perspective and how compassionate and gracious it is because I look to be more patient in conversations around immigration as well, and I can see that you've probably had to have a lot of patience from talking to people. Um, so I'm just going to leave you with the same question I asked Tess. If you could encourage families in this holiday season to partake in any act of welcome, what would you ask them to do?
Yeah, I think Tess had some really good answers to that. I think, depending on the readiness of your family or your community, whoever you're celebrating the holidays with, I think take steps that are appropriate for you. Maybe it is a Bible study, maybe it is going to an international market, or maybe it's inviting someone over. But I think, like, as I was talking about with our podcast, like in all that you do, listen more than you speak. Try to understand where people are coming from. And that's with your family or that's with the international community, because so often we come into conversations and we're listening to respond rather than just listening. Right? Like you talk to an immigrant and they're talking about their cultures and you're like so ready to respond about what your culture does. Or, you're listening to your cousin who you know is going to have a different opinion about you than immigration and you're ready to like respond with the next fact or the next answer, but instead just listen. Take that time to be in a place where you are probably uncomfortable, but give the other person time to share as much as they want. Ask deeper questions, try to understand their point of view. There's a great method called deep listening, and it's just about listening to a person and what they're saying so well that you can articulate it back to them in a way that they would agree with what you've said. And I encourage you to try that kind of listening this holiday season. Just be a present to other people.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And thanks so much for joining us and answering all these questions.
Of course, thank you for
And
having me.
of course, so I'll be putting the link to Ashley's podcast, Hope in Action, Navigating Immigration with Hope and Care, in the chat. And now we're going to go ahead and move into breakout rooms, just to discuss the conversation that we had today, but then also that you guys can share your perspectives with each other on what you think about going home to talk about immigration and navigating difficult conversations. So I'll be putting that link in the chat, and we'll be splitting up into breakout rooms. Thanks.
Thanks, Tanner. I'm gonna put the recording on